Hello, everyone. I'm Sally Davies, Senior Editor at Aeon and Psyche, and it's my pleasure today to convene this Brocher Meetup on the ethics of humanitarianism. We live in a historical moment in which more than 80 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes due to war, violence, persecution, and catastrophe. It is therefore urgent that nation states, NGOs, and other actors critically consider the role of humanitarianism in alleviating human suffering, be it as a discourse, a set of practices, or a historical phenomenon. Today, it is my pleasure to convene this meetup featuring an impressive panel of scholars and practitioners at the forefront of this global conversation about the ethics of humanitarianism, its historical roots, and its future evolution. I'll start by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Bertrand, I'll hand over to you first.
Oh, okay. I'm Bertrand Taithe. I'm a professor at the Humanitarian Conflict Response Institute of the University of Manchester, and I'm also on the scientific committee of Triage at MSF Paris.
You might have to explain Triage.
Centre de réflexion sur
l'action
et les savoirs humanitaires. Yeah, it's a think tank, I guess. That's the phrase.
Thank you. Caroline?
So I'm the director of SOS Mediterranean in Switzerland.
Thank you very much. And Karl?
I'm a professor in humanitarian public health at University of Geneva, and I'm the director of the Geneva Center of Humanitarian Studies.
Thank you so much. So today I think we're going to try and talk for around 45 minutes. We might run slightly over. And please do feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we will be sure to throw open the floor to audience participation towards the end. I think to begin with, Bertrand is going to set the scene for us with a brief presentation, and then we will pick up some of the themes that he raises in conversation. Bertrand, over to you.
Oh, okay. And it's not really a presentation, but I think everybody's got in mind the situation in Ukraine. And I think when we set up the conversation, we originally thought about the state of the humanitarian sector. We developed this idea a few months ago, and I had very different ideas about what we were going to talk about than what people are probably going to think about today. So that was the main thing is just how swiftly things have changed. But that's a change, a geopolitical change, and one that should not obscure the realities of what the humanitarian needs are around. You rightly pointed out that there are millions and millions of people that have been displaced, hundreds of millions who are in need of humanitarian aid, and that even though the Ukrainian war is first and foremost in many of our preoccupations, it shouldn't be the only story in town. So I think there's something very dangerous in following the realignment of the world that was suggested by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine only yesterday, saying the world has changed, the Rubicon is crossed. Today, the free world is Ukraine-centric. Well, that's so basically projecting us back to some sort of Cold War realities is an issue. And I just wanted to raise a few things that are of interest. Of course, where is the humanitarian system in response to a conflict like the Ukraine war? And I think it's striking if you contrast, for example, what humanitarian agencies, even large ones like the ICRC, can provide and what has been sent. So, for example, there's one figure that really struck me, is that over the last 10 days, 70,000 tons of humanitarian aid, whatever that may be, were sent to Ukraine, of which 200 tons came from ICRC. Now, I have no doubt in my mind that the ICRC shipment was probably more useful than much of the rest of the 70,000 tons, but it just gives us a sense of proportion of the amount of outrage, compassion, or devotion that has taken place in the last few weeks. Now, there are things that are a bit worrying. Well, there are many things that are very worrying about this war. But one thing that should always arrest us is that neither side seems to stick with the letter or even the ideals of the Geneva Convention. That we find that the soldiers are paraded, prisoners of war are paraded by both sides, that they are treated in a very opaque way. We don't actually know what's going on. There are attacks on healthcare, attacks on hospitals. from the Russian side of things. There's a lot of things that are very troubling about this conflict, and the way we're representing the conflict is perhaps not entirely helpful. Also, in my view, what's really interesting is that if we think more broadly about what's going on in Ukraine and ask ourselves, where did it all begin? When did it begin? And let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that this is a Third World War. And you may argue that it isn't because we are not yet at war, but you may also argue that we are already at war economically through a game of sanctions and weapons provisions. Then when did we begin? And it's worth asking ourselves because, in fact, there has been Russian activities, campaigning, warfare, private warfare in a range of countries like Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, Mali, and of course, Syria. Now, if we look at the actual emergencies in those countries, in Central African Republic, they reckon that 63% of the population is in need of humanitarian relief. 63%. That in Mali, about 6 million, these figures come, by the way, from OCHA, from the United Nations. I picked them up today. That in Mali, there's 5.9 million persons in need of humanitarian assistance. That in Syria, of course, there's 5.7 million refugees, 3.7 million, roughly, are in Turkey alone. So we just think at the scale of these wars, and in each of these wars, what do we find? Well, we find that the Russians were active either directly or through a private proxy, the so-called Wagner Group, which is a fairly opaque form of military involvement in these regions. So if we are in a conflict in Ukraine, if there is a conflict in Ukraine, let's look a bit broader and think, where are the other conflicts that are going on right now? And what is the scale of the need worldwide? I think these are the main things that I'd like to flag up, is that a lot of the conflicts elsewhere are still going on, just because we don't mention them very much. The conflict in Tigray, which is extremely opaque. We have very limited information about Tigray, and you should always be wary of those conflicts you don't hear of very much, because the next thing you know is when you see the refugees eventually arriving to us. Now, we can discuss that in future, and part of me thinks that perhaps something is happening with this Ukraine refugee crisis, that we may rethink the way we treat refugees. This is what I hope that we will rethink the way we treat refugees, people who are flying from war-torn situations, and that we may actually, and it's very cynical, when we say, get some of the generosity that we used to display during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, if you were actually running away from a communist regime, you did get more support, more acceptance than if you are running away from a civil war in Africa. So I'm thinking, is there something going on right now? I'm just putting things up in the air like that, but is there going to be a realignment of a world vision, and is it going to benefit directly or indirectly people in real need of help? And is that help going to be, well, colorblind? And is it going to be not based on whether these people look like us and drive cars like us? This is a quote from a minister in the United Kingdom recently. So that's all I wanted to state at this stage, but I just wanted to, if you want more figures, let's carry on. We currently had the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom visiting Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is conducting a war by proxy in Yemen. In Yemen, we reckon that there's about 20 million people that are in acute need, 12 million people in acute need, and there's 4 million people that have been displaced by the war. I don't think I've read a line about Yemen in the last few weeks or even few months. So part of the problem of this extraordinary mobilization of sympathy is that, of course, it hides an awful lot of things. So I'll leave it there.
It's very interesting, having read the accounts of the differential treatment of refugees from different parts of the world, particularly at the Polish border, and how just the profound, stark differentials between the welcome that Ukrainian refugees have received versus the physical beatings and other forms of mistreatment that refugees from other parts of the world have received. But I think what you're suggesting is that maybe there will be a spillover effect, in a sense, that the fact that there's been this outpouring of global sympathy will hopefully cause Western nation states to reconsider their refugee policies overall. Caroline, I'd love to hear from you, because it's I think very interesting for people who've for a long time been involved in humanitarian responses, in your case in the Mediterranean. What has been your reaction to the global outpouring of sympathy for Ukrainian refugees, and how does that compare, in your experience, to the way people have responded to refugee crisis with people crossing the Mediterranean?
Thank you. Just two things to build on what Bertrand has been saying. I think there's two things at stake. The first one is the proximity to the conflict. That is definitely, and we saw that with the work we are doing in the Mediterranean. It's when you talk about the Yemen, Syria, and then the Mediterranean was at the doorstep of Europe. So it was something different. It was also something different for the public here. And I'm only going to talk about the way the Swiss public has responded to both Ukraine and the Mediterranean Sea. So it was close, but not weirdly. Ukraine is closer to the Swiss than the Mediterranean is. And it brings me to the other topic that I wanted to touch upon listening to Bertrand, is the way the thing is a good word, is publicized, and the way the media are actually projecting things on people crossing the Mediterranean or crossing borders, and the way we respond to, or the public responds to that. In terms of what's going on in the Mediterranean at the moment, so I did the calculation a few weeks ago. If the central Mediterranean were to be a conflict, it rank, and it was before Ukraine, it would rank 5 or 6 on the top 10 of the deadlier conflict in the world, which is massive. And that's actually why NGOs started being involved, was because the mortality rate was equivalent to active conflict mortality rates. Last year, for the first time since 2017, the mortality rate has actually increased by 40%, which is huge. And we're still at the moment in the central Mediterranean with a lot of departures, a lot of shipwrecks. There was a shipwreck last week, 50 people dead not far from Morocco. Absolutely no one spoke about that, or there was like barely a line in the newspaper. So the situation is still going on. And just to go back to my first point on the way the closeness of the conflict, of the situation, it's one of the things we've heard in Switzerland was, it's good that you're actually rescuing those people, but at the end of the day, are they going to come to Switzerland? And that was the main issue. That was the main question, but because we cannot accept to receive so many people. I mean, so many people. When you talk about numbers, it's a joke when you compare to the number of people, for example, Lebanon has accepted when they kept their borders open at the beginning of the Syrian war. So it's all relative, but the way it's being seen, when you see that Geneva, for example, is preparing at the moment to welcome 15,000 people, and they're welcoming them, and which is of course good, and I'm not questioning the goodness of the welcoming in Geneva. I'm just saying it's actually very particular to see the sense of solidarity, of humanity, of being that much divided, and it's actually quite impressive to see that and to witness that.
It just seems a shame that it's so unequally distributed, and that which people are the recipients of that sort of goodwill. But seems.
Go ahead. But when you look, for example, the last the last rescues we did were a few weeks ago, and we had 247 people on board the Ocean Viking, and the three main nationalities of people rescued were Egyptian, Syrians, and people from Bangladesh. And as far as I am aware, the Syria conflict is still not over. So it's a bit like, but because we heard, I think it was yesterday, there was a declaration from a Swiss politician saying, yeah, but now we need to make, to have some kind of triage between the people who are really coming because they're fleeing a conflict and people who are not coming from fleeing a conflict. And it goes again to that notion of you have good ones and you have bad ones. You have good refugees, bad refugees, migrants, refugees, this and that. And it's extremely, as Bertrand was saying, it's extremely dangerous actually to play with that idea that you have good ones who should be accepted because they look like us, because they are closer to us, because all that, to other people. We should be very careful in how we phrase things at the moment.
But if we want to be logical, and I mean, this was part of my argument ad absurdum, but if you actually say, well, the world is split between good and bad, and we are good, of course, and then the people are bad on the other side, well, let's recognize that a lot of the people that are fleeing conflict, like Eritrea and Tigray, are actually fleeing conflicts in which arguably our opponents have a part. People fleeing Syria, there are Russian bombings in Syria, there are Russian presence in Syria, there has been for years. In Kar, you have Russian mercenaries. So if you really want to play the Cold War card, at least be completely logical with it. And actually expand your welcome to those people who are also fleeing those conflicts, because they are fleeing conflicts that we have allowed to fester, or that we have done very little to stop. We didn't have the same kind of moral indignation, or maybe we had moral indignation, but we took no measures whatsoever, or very few measures in comparison to what goes on today. So I think it's, if you really want to go, and I'm not suggesting we should, but if we want to go towards a Cold War mentality, well, let's go the full hog, because then that will make us a little bit more welcoming than we ever are today. We are the worst possible juncture, where we have the selfishness of Fortress Europe combined with a Cold War mentality. I mean, at least in the Cold War, we were more open.
Karl, I wondered if you wanted to jump in at this point, having recently returned from Afghanistan.
I'm warm now.
Good.
I want to jump in to reflect. I wrote down a few reflections from what Bertrand and Caroline were talking about. There is no doubt, and we could not prove the contrary. There's a double standard. That's very clear. What Afghan refugees at the border with Poland or Syrian refugees, what they have experienced, where people were starving and dying in the cold in the forest, has nothing to do with the warm welcome they have received, the Ukrainians have received from Poland. So that's very clear. It's hard for us. I mean, we're trying to, as academics and activists or NGO, we're trying to make clear that this is not acceptable, and we need to change. But more and more, if we look at what is going on in Ukraine and what we have experienced across the sea, or in Greece and Turkey and Lebanon as well, I mean, there's a lot of that's clear, and let's not forget, we are still in a pandemic. Okay, what we have seen is that this sense of humanity during this COVID-19 pandemic has been quite challenged by governments. Closure of borders everywhere, a sense of we need to close down and go back home and stay at home and so on. In a sense, in a way, this generosity that we see all around is a beautiful expression of humanity. I'm worried about this coordination of all this generosity, not well channeled and not going to the right places. Caroline was talking about proximity. I mean, it's clear. I mean, a colleague of mine reminded me about these geographies of compassion. It's very clear that this geographical, physical proximity with Ukrainians, can be an explanation of why there is much more generosity than people who are crossing the sea. However, I was reminded 10 days ago by a journalist about the notion of humanitarian corridor. And then suddenly I worked in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, and so it was a huge proximity. We didn't end the war very quickly. It lasted 4 years in the old former Yugoslavia, and it's just across the northern Italy. So in terms of proximity, it's just here. It just we can reach it with the hand almost from Geneva. So I'm not sure that the physical proximity can be the whole explanation. When we think about humanitarian corridor, I had some reflection about the fact that people have too much hope in humanitarianism, and I think it's a full illusion of what humanitarian aid can achieve. Both in Bosnia, people didn't want in Sarajevo a humanitarian corridor. They wanted to have a political decision to end the war. And instead, Mitterrand gave a humanitarian corridor. And 3 years later, they were still at war. It's exactly the same here in Ukraine. We need some decisions, or the politicians need to make some strong decisions. I'm not saying going to war, but I'm saying that this needs to be resolved by politicians. And unfortunately, humanitarians are going to put plasters on heavy wounds, on open wounds everywhere in the country. And we are faced in many places, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, with crises that are way beyond the capacity of the humanitarian system to respond. The intensity, the scale is far too broad and too large. It's impossible to take all the humanitarian organizations together, combined, and they won't have the capacity to respond. That's very clear. So that's a new reality, and that's something we need to keep in mind. I do think that there's a huge disconnect, and we see that in as Caroline was saying, the generosity of the people, and then the disconnect with the governments. I mean, UK is an astonishing example of non-action, but they are not the only ones, where the legal system for welcoming refugees, giving them access to work and to housing and accommodation, healthcare, that's something we're going to study and monitor in Europe. How much Ukrainians are going to get access to free healthcare in Europe? That's going to be a huge issue. Okay, knowing the low vaccination rate of Ukrainians on childhood vaccination, for example, the first thing you need to do as a host country is to vaccinate Ukrainians. That's very clear. How much are they going to get access to these vaccinations? It's a key question for us. And we talk about the representation of refugees. So I hope Bertrand is right that this new movement, I mean, 3-4 million Ukrainians expected in Western Europe, I hope that's going to shake the legal system and the policies and the politics. I hope so. But if you look at the terminology we use to talk about refugees, when you look at the maps people put on TV, on screen, you have, it's like an invasion. They put arrows of people coming and going to your country. It's an invasion of Ukrainians. That's terrible. The way we represent people and refugees has to change completely. And that's important.
But just to react on that, but the wording is extremely important because they've never spoken, at least all the articles I've read in the last days, they don't speak about the wave or about invasion or about the vocabulary that is being used for other places like the Mediterranean. And the wording used is very different, and it does matter a lot.
The reason why I was perhaps a little bit optimistic is not because I'm an optimist by nature. Anybody who knows me will know that, but really because it's because when you have to address a situation and you have to create structures, then the structures are based in law. And the fact is, people have rights, whether you like the color of their skin or not. So when the British government, which has been extremely tone deaf and unable to listen to its own population and how it responded to the crisis, is now opening offices near Calais, or they promised it, they haven't done it yet, but they're promising to open a visa office in Calais, another one in Lille. Ironically, because they want to close the door to too many Ukrainians, they're actually opening the door to non-Ukrainians, because ultimately people should be able to use the law against the arbitrary nature of the state. And that's a small positive move. It's not based on generosity, it's based actually on the reverse principle. However, because you create these little spaces where people can be heard, then, well, the law is the law. And if people have a claim to an asylum, then they should be able to be heard and perhaps not risk their life in a stupid way of having to cross on dinghies the North Sea, because that's the other thing, is that people are drowning in the North Sea today. They're also drowning in what they call the English Channel. So that's my optimism. So it's not super optimistic really, but it's just saying that the minute you actually start looking at human beings as human beings, and you start creating structures to actually treat them, to actually welcome them, to actually vaccinate them, to make sure that they are actually preserved from the most heinous consequences of the war, then you have to open up the same approach to everybody. It's worth pointing out that this war in Ukraine is going to show some of the inequities in the humanitarian system, namely, those who left first were socioeconomically the better off. Those who are left behind are socioeconomically the worse off. And among them, the worst of the worst off are the aged. And I think in Ukraine, in those devastated small towns at the border of the conflict, what do you find? Well, according to HelpAge, you find that it is the 99% of elderly people who refuse to move. And that is a staggering figure, and they know what they're talking about. They've been on the border of the Donbass region for a long time. And when they tell you that 99% of older people report that they do not want to leave or be evacuated, then you know these people are going to be bearing the brunt, and they're going to bear the brunt in so many different ways, because they won't have access to medication, they won't have access to healthcare, they won't have access to food, heating, light, etc., etc.
I wanted to pick up on something that Karl mentioned, which was the fact that we are arguably overburdening the humanitarian system with our expectations, that presently and in the coming years, the scale of the crisis is such that humanitarian actors will be unable to respond adequately. Karl, or indeed anyone else who wishes to jump in, what do you think the practical and ethical implications are of that insight for how humanitarian actors ought to comport themselves, and the kind of strategies they might need to deploy, both in terms of the practical work they do on the ground, but also communicating what they're doing to the global community?
Well, that's a very good question, Sally. I think what we have seen in the past, okay, let's go back to some history, and I will start with my personal story. When I started working in the humanitarian system, we used to work a lot in tropical countries, as we call them, and we were deployed for 4 months, 5 months, 6 months in a field hospital, and then we were, after 6 months, packing everything and leaving. Okay, today In Syria, people are working in Syria. A lot of relief agencies are working in Syria after 11 years. People are still working at the border with Syria, in Turkey and Lebanon after 11 years, and so on and so on. Refugee camps where work in northern Kenya, Dadaab, have been there for 3 generations. There are a lot of situations that have been prolonged over decades now. And so what we have seen is not only the scale, as you're talking about, but as well the nature of the work has completely changed. It does mean that when you are a humanitarian organization, you are starting to build a relationship with authorities. You need to negotiate your entry point or your entrance and your stay and maintaining your stay. The second aspect, when you talk about scale, so first of all, I would like to challenge this notion of system. I think I've used this word, humanitarian system. I'm not sure there's a kind of homogeneity inside. You've got the UN agencies, and we all compete with each other. And I'm experiencing that now, today, in Afghanistan. I'm telling you, in 10 days, I'm going to be in a summit invited by WHO and UNICEF, where we're going to discuss with the government, the Taliban government, about the future of the health system. Already having some consensus amongst UN agencies is already a huge challenge. So UN agencies, then you've got the NGOs, and that's just another world. People, they all have different mandates, different targets, different accountability systems. And then we've got all the local organizations. The first responders, let's not forget, when we talk about Syria, when we talk about Ukraine, when we talk about an earthquake in Haiti or the tsunami in Indonesia, are local populations. Okay? Yeah. Hopefully they are trained, hopefully they have some skills, but they are part of the humanitarian system. The scale of the events that we have experienced in different places in the world does mean that more and more, and that's good news, all these actors are talking to each other. They realize that their weakness is to work in silo. And more what we see is a lot of alliances between different organizations. RCRC talking to MSF, UN agencies collaborating with NGOs, and so on and so on. And this was not the case in the past, because they were very comfortable into the world. And I do think now the scale of the events has actually shaken a little bit the way people work. There's still a lot of silos. I can see Caroline smiling, so I'm sure she was that. Please do so, please.
No. It's just because it's also that this Western-centered humanitarian system is also very much questioned in the last years. And so if ICRC is discussing with MSF and UN agencies have to talk to each other for once since they were created, it's also because they've been very much tackled and questioned in the last years on this model of sending people abroad, which are probably not up to the task, and you were mentioning localization. It's also something that is, I mean, we've been playing with this idea of localization of aid since years. What has been concretely done in order to make sure that people are actually trained, people are able to manage the first phase of a conflict or a natural catastrophe, it still remains to be seen. But I think it's extremely interesting that the scale that you were mentioning, Sally, is also arriving at a time where the system itself is very much into question at the moment.
If we look at scale, just keep in mind that just the amounts that have been disbursed in the last 3 weeks to support the military effort in Ukraine represent, I think, about 60% of the annual budget of everything humanitarians do. So that's, I mean, I couldn't vouch for sure, but it's roughly that kind of order figure. So we are really talking about, to talk about the system is to pretend that, first of all, it's totally coordinated. It isn't. That it's running smoothly. It doesn't. And that it has cogs and clear mechanisms. It does in places, but not generally. So it's a bit fooling ourselves, but also it's also terribly small. It's terribly inadequate for the scale of the events and the fact that, as Karl pointed out, many of these conflicts are becoming very entrenched. Now, I sincerely hope that the Ukrainian conflict will not drag on like the war in ex-Yugoslavia did, because eventually, if you look at it closely, you've got nearly 9 years of conflict in the 1990s, because we ended up with Kosovo. So it really is not to be wished. But many of those conflicts, like in Yemen and in Ethiopia or elsewhere, have been going on for years, sometimes decades, and in that context, I think the humanitarian system can only provide a very inadequate but symbolically very important response.
But that's what is interesting with the Ukraine, is that European populations themselves have responded very quickly and massively. In last week in Switzerland, there were 51 million Swiss francs raised in one day by the in the general population. 51 million Swiss francs, and it's massive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's interesting. I think the governments are behind. You know, they're running behind their public opinion, and that's, to me, is a very good move.
Look, I'm just giving an example of double standard. In August 2021, so last August, we had I was working with the Ministry of Public Health, working with the minister and his directors and so on. At some point, at the end of the month, Kabul was taken. All these high-level people have to leave the country. They were threatened by the Taliban. And some of them went to Europe, Turkey, and I've got a very good colleague of mine who went to Islamabad. He has been waiting now for 4 months to get a visa from Switzerland. We have a post for him, waiting for him at University of Geneva. And the authorities are still not granted any visa for this person who has given his career to healthcare in Afghanistan. Okay, and there is money for him. There's a salary waiting for him, but no, it's not working. This week, I heard that all the visas in Switzerland. So I don't know, Caroline. I'm not a legal person, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But they have a special permit, a visa, that's correct, that gives them access to Switzerland and to the labor market, is that correct? Which is absolutely exceptional. Apparently, it hasn't happened since, I think they gave a date that it has not been granted since the end of the Second World War, is that correct? And that's amazing. So the double standard exists, okay? So my colleague is still waiting. It's one individual case, but it was very hard to convince the authorities that this intellectual would actually provide some good to our university and to Geneva by bringing his expertise to this environment. So that's just amazing.
I mean, I have a similar story. My colleagues and I were asked to define the criteria to help intellectuals fleeing countries under threat. The obvious target, the obvious reason being that our university wanted to respond to the indignation against the Ukraine crisis. And we basically decided to present them with a challenge. We basically said, well, let's use the Uppsala definition of conflict. And if we use that, which is a scientific criteria, you actually open up the box and you're basically saying, well, an intellectual fleeing conflict or fearing for her life in Eritrea has the same exact value, same exact rights as somebody fleeing Ukraine today or Russia for that matter. Because the concept of dissident, which we used to have for people fleeing oppression, has to be revived, and this is why, you know, I was playing really with this idea of Cold War logic. But the Cold War logic opened up all sorts of categories of welcome, which we've forgotten about. And I had this horrific experience of comparing with students years ago the situation, our attitude to both peoples in the 1970s and 80s. How Western countries had welcomed hundreds of thousands of people fleeing oppression in Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and the situation of the boat people, not called boat people, but people taking boats in the Mediterranean. And some of the students basically said, well, the people in the 1980s were mad. And that was a horrifying moment when I realized that we had lost an awful lot of our humanity in the intervening 30 years. They hadn't really thought about their response, but it was really quite striking and it stayed with me. So I think by reopening special cases, privilege access perhaps, you are opening up a whole legal toolbox, because ultimately what will stop you from challenging the decision to give one person privilege access against another? There is such a thing as we are societies of the law normally, and I think we should be able to employ that in future. So that's my glimmer of hope. It's a bit it's not great.
I'm glad there's some reasons for optimism in this conversation. I wanted to pick up on a slightly different strand here, which is to look at the changes to the moral status of humanitarianism in recent history. So, for example, from the early 2000s, there were many critiques of humanitarianism that came to the fore by virtue of its rhetorical association with forms of what might be called imperial conquest or wars, humanitarianism as an ethic and a logic being used as a cover for conflicts, particularly by Western powers against others. We seem to be in a new period now, but I wondered if the panel had any reflections about how that somewhat troubled recent history of humanitarianism affects and constrains the way humanitarian actors are able to intervene today. And I also wonder, as a related question, whether the present crises we're facing, albeit of a different nature, will also affect the scope of humanitarian action in the future. Does anyone want to jump in on those points?
I think I will not go on the history aspect of it. I'm not competent, but there's a huge discrepancy between the image that the humanitarian NGOs or humanitarian organizations in general are carrying or transporting about how does the humanitarian worker look like, and discrepancy between this image and reality. I mean, you go to South Sudan today, you're going to meet MSF people in the hospital, and they are from Uganda, Kenya, Congo, and here we are. You go and work go and visit humanitarian organizations in Greece, working in refugee camps. Sorry, it's the same. You have Greek healthcare workers, social workers, psychologists working in refugee camps, employed by international organizations or national organizations. So I think there's a huge discrepancy between the image and reality. The reality has moved much faster than the marketing or the publicity or the communication used by these organizations, I think.
Yeah, it's not north-south anymore. It may have been, and I doubt even that it ever was, to the degree we imagine it. It's just that people from the north were better at writing their memoirs and talking about themselves. But it was always the local, the bulk of the workforce was always local. But what's really interesting is this south-south. So if you work with people with Médecins Sans Frontières, you go to Tashkent and the head of mission might be from Kenya. And conversely, you go to South Sudan. These are real examples, by the way. And the head of mission is from Myanmar. And you just think, well, this is that there has been this massive internationalization, and these people are doing it not simply because it's a career path, but that's actually because they are internationalists to exactly the same degree as anybody who wishes to be a humanitarian. So I think there is a problem. That there has been a problem of representation from that level. There's a question which is an interesting one, perhaps one for you, Caroline, actually, about the gender and age profile, I guess, of the refugees from Ukraine versus the people who might have crossed on on a boat.
I'm not sure we can generalize. I'm a bit yeah, because I was reading the question earlier. It's very different. People are fleeing Eritrea. Young men are fleeing Eritrea because they don't want to be stuck in the military, for example. So of course, people fleeing are mainly young men, young women as well. By the way, on the Ocean Viking, we have approximately 30% of non-accompanied minors. Syrian refugees were men, women, and children. So I'm not completely sure that Ukrainian, that we can make the difference between Ukraine is providing women and children while men stay behind to defend their country, which is also one narrative that we hear a lot these days, while other conflict would have not created the same type of refugees. I'm not very comfortable with that, I have to say.
It is correct. I mean, we conducted a study a few years back in Greece, in refugee camps, and we were surrounded by families, men, women, and children, and they all have left together Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan. So they were all around. I'm thinking about, we had written this paper, and there's a nice title to it by the first author who wrote that, Pia, and she wrote, this paper is called Life in Waiting. So we are super enthusiastic about the fact that people get access to Western Europe countries, accommodation. A lot of people who are offering their house and their flats, beds and rooms. The challenge is going to come just after, in the next few months, when people are going to wait for a decision about their future. So, and this is exactly what people have experienced in Greece, for example, where the status is not going to be very clear. Their access to the healthcare system is not going to be very clear. It won't be done from one day to another. Who is going to cover the care? What about, I don't know, I give an example about oncology and cancer, for example. Do we provide free cancer treatment to anybody arriving now between the 10th of March until the end of the summer? So these are the key questions that the governments have not thought about. They are, I think, pushed by the population to be generous and to open the borders. And I think that's fantastic. But this life in waiting in Greece and in other refugee camps has created a lot of depression, anxiety amongst populations. And that's something as well that's going to hit us in the face at some point very quickly. And I'm thinking about all these generous families in Western Europe who are going to open their house. And we are going to be disarmed because we are not professionals to deal with this kind of conditions. How are we going to deal with that? What kind of support are we going to receive from professionals to actually make sure that we can mitigate the effects of this uncertainty on these families or these individuals?
Well,
I think, oh, go ahead, Bertrand.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that question about age and gender. And it's kind of interesting because it reflects some of the binaries that we've constructed in the not so distant past. If you look at refugees at the end of the Second World War, which, by the way, displaced tens of millions of people, then the good refugee was a young man. That was a useful refugee. That was somebody you could actually put to work. And the notion that a young man is an undesirable refugee is an extraordinary construct. It's very uneconomic, actually, if you think about it from a very pragmatic perspective. But it's a fairly recent one, and it's one that's been force-fed to us. But there is absolutely no reason why young men are actually less deserving than a young child. In terms of social cost, a young man contributes more rapidly to a society in which he or she is involved. So it's a very strange notion and I don't want to leave it like that floating, because if you don't deconstruct it and you don't actually get to the fact that this is how we've ended up subdividing humanities in different categories of worthiness, extraordinarily so, but even illogically so. It's not even, it's not even an economic or rational thinking that we're talking, or an ethical thinking. It's just one that reflects some kind of demonization process, largely associated with or portrayal of young men as being the criminal class of today.
I wonder, Bertrand, on this point, if I'm conscious that we're coming to the top of the hour, but if I could pick up on something you said earlier, which was the potential for a recovery or even reinvention of concepts that allow us to expand our sympathy, going beyond what legally, of course, refugee is quite a narrow term as it's understood in international law. And maybe in some ways that's abetted some of these exclusionary rhetorical practices that are that get perpetuated in the media and so forth. You mentioned, of course, the concept of dissident from the Cold War. I just wondered if there were any other sort of conceptual innovations, rhetorical innovations that you saw coming to the fore that can be mobilized in order to create channels for human empathy.
Ooh, that's thank you.
You have 2 hours.
I have 10 seconds. It's kind of interesting. The status of the refugee dates from a European convention, which was about European refugees. Okay, so let's remember where it come from. In a way, we're back to where we were in 1951, and this is a really interesting viewpoint. There are literally countries like Turkey which have signed the 1951 convention, but not the subsequent amendments, and therefore their notion of refugee legally is not a Syrian. A Syrian cannot be a refugee because that's not part of the categories they've subscribed to. You have to be European in the 1951 convention. So it's just, so a lot of the tools at our disposal are incredibly dated, incredibly poor, and reflect a geopolitical order to which we may return. I mean, this is the striking thing, is that so much of the rhetoric is back to this Cold War rhetoric, and it worries me enormously that we are back to this Cold War rhetoric. But a lot of the tools of the international architecture were based in the Cold War. We've actually done very little in terms of innovation in relation to the Geneva Convention or further amendments of rights since the 1970s. So that's an interesting question. Why is that? We've done a lot of things around, weapons and demining and things like that. There's a lot of side. But the fundamentals haven't been terribly touched, I don't think, for a very long time. And that's a kind of, so perhaps we have stalled in some respect, at least on the conceptual level.
But oh, go ahead, Caroline.
No, but there's a lot of concerns on the fact that if we start touching the refugee convention, then it would actually mean the collapse of it. So there's a lot of people who are very cautious on, okay, it's not that great, but it's a tool that works, and let's keep it that way and not touch it at all. And just an anecdote on this idea of legal status, we've had many times, and by students, the question, so how do you make the difference between refugees and migrants when you're on board the ship? And one day I said, laughing, so we're asking people, so when they're in the dinghy, we're asking people where they come from, and depending on the answer, we actually take them on board or not. And they looked at me and they said, okay. And I was like, no, it was a bad joke. Actually, we don't do that. We take everyone who's in distress at sea, wherever they come from, and that's not. It's a question of legal status, and we don't have anything to do with the legal status. So it's but I was quite shocked as Bertrand to say that they didn't react. I mean, it was when I said that, they were like, okay.
Yeah, the irony, of course, is that to be a migrant means you're affecting a journey. Yeah. To be a refugee is entirely distinct. It has absolutely no bearing on whether you walked or not. I mean, it's striking. The two things are put side by side, but they're not at all describing the same processes.
And so it's, go ahead, Karl.
Being a refugee is the end of the journey, for many people in the world. So you have the status, and that's it. And then what's next? No, that's it. you feel happy you're lucky enough to have this status. So it's astonishing. I like your description of journey and end of a journey. I think it is interesting. And Caroline, I think your story is okay, shocking, but I think it illustrates a lot maybe amongst the young population, how we have failed maybe in the news to inform them about sense of humanity. And as well, you know, when we talked about Ebola, all the stories we had was about triage. They said, we are overloaded and we close the door and we're only going to select people who are very much at the end. Remember, so maybe that's the way we describe all of that. We have mis-explained that actually this triage is necessary to save some people as well.
But I don't know if you remember, but last year there was an article in the Tribune de Genève saying Genève is going to start triaging people. And the day after, I had a course with the students in the Lausanne University, and they were shocked because, you know, triage in Switzerland was something that they would never have thought would happen one day. And we had an interesting discussion because when you read the article, it was people over 85 would question the admission in intensive care or not at the university at the hospital of Geneva. And I told them, but it's really interesting because first it means you actually have a population of 85 plus people that is big enough to actually make a case, and most of the countries in the world don't have that population of 85 and above. And second, triage is actually a reality of approximately every single country in the world. And I remember having done, I don't know how many triage trainings in Iraqi hospitals. That was the first thing. We were putting green, orange, and red lines everywhere in the hospitals in Iraq. And we had to do that, and that was the job. But it was really interesting to see that here, those were notions that they didn't have at all. And the pandemic brought that like here.
I mean, I think just to conclude, I think what's very striking in some of these remarks about your students and a sort of degree of inadvertent callousness that is present in their acceptance of, you know, some of these tongue-in-cheek remarks you've made is a sense among Western populations that they or we are not vulnerable to some of these forms of human suffering, and that, you know, in some sense, maybe to do a Bertrand-like maneuver here in terms of trying to find a silver lining or an optimistic take is that at least the pandemic sort of made many people realize our fundamental interconnection and vulnerability to one another. And I mean, this is maybe something for Western Europe, the Ukraine crisis, by virtue of its proximity, there's a realization that Western populations are vulnerable as well. These are not conflicts that are happening to places that seem remote. So maybe, you know, maybe there are reasons for optimism that this will herald a new era of kind of humanitarian awareness. We can but hope. In our final few minutes, do any of the panelists just want to make any concluding remarks about anything we've discussed?
I can just rebound on this point. I think it's important. It's a misunderstanding to think humanitarianism was primarily north-south, or from the West to, say, Africa or Southeast Asia. It has been doing a lot of that in the last 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. But historically, over the last 100 and so years, the bulk of humanitarian needs and the bulk of humanitarian operations have been in Europe. And the idea that Europe should be a safe haven that should not encounter humanitarian need when we see it in the street every day, when we actually have had conflicts in Yugoslavia, in places where people go on holiday, or today in places like Odessa or Kiev, is just showing that we misremember why and how we developed humanitarian organizations, the humanitarian principles, attempted to further international humanitarian law, whether or not it works, and whether or not it's respected. At least it's a bit of an effort.
Very good point. Caroline or Karl, do you have any concluding remarks before we close out the meetup?
Just the fact that it's probably the first time in my entire life that I hear Bertrand being optimistic, so that's going to be my take.
Pretty limited still.
No, it's probably also the first time that I'm far less optimistic than you. I'm not sure it's actually going to change anything. It's
no, I'm not either. But you know, come on, we've got to try.
No, I know, but I remember and sorry, I'm going to probably. But I guess you all remember the pictures of this little Syrian child, Aylan Kurdi, who was found dead on the beach in Greece. And I remember people saying at that time, you see, this is really like the turnover of the issue of migration via maritime routes. And it was the 2nd of September 2015, if I recall correctly. We're in 2022, and we have an increase of the mortality rate by 40%. So sorry. That was.
I think you're probably right.
Karl, do you have any concluding
you
remarks?
need to
Karl,
do something, you know.
No, I'm thinking. I don't think I'm as wise and philosophical as Caroline and Bertrand. I don't think there's to go back to humanitarian organizations. I think let's go back to what they can do. I think they can do a lot. They have a lot of. They are more and more professional. They have their expertise in a lot of domains. They work in a system that is not coherent and not cohesive. That's pretty sure. But we have seen in many places that actually humanitarian work done by communities, local organizations, or international organizations can save a lot of lives, can have a huge effect on populations, either in terms of psychological support, but as well being around, but as well providing care or food or any kind of service. So I just hope that more and more what we can do, and I think that to me that's the future. It's making sure that all these skills and expertise can be widely available to a higher number of people, individuals, you, me, so that we can have some effect in our surrounding environment and community. So and I think that's the best I could do. And these humanitarian organizations, instead of doing, I think now they need to turn their back a little bit, and then they probably need to share the expertise to a higher number. So I do think that making sure that this knowledge and this expertise is widely available and open access and so on, I think that can save a lot of lives.
Well, thank you all for this nuanced, probing and wide-ranging discussion. It's been a pleasure for me, and really appreciate your time and expertise, and I hope that some of the good predictions come to pass. We will see in the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.